Hello English 1102 students, welcome to my video lecture on Alice Walker's short story Everyday Use. Everyday Use is a story that is very frequently anthologized. Just about every literature collection you can imagine includes Everyday Use in it. For those of you that are going to Darton or to Albany State, depending upon what time you're watching this video, Alice Walker's from South Georgia. She's from Eatonton. She was born there and raised there. She had a bit of an eventful childhood. She lost an eye in a BB gun accident when her brother accidentally shot her in it. She actually has written an essay about that called When the Dancer is the Other Self. And I think you should read that because it's a very inspirational story about how a young girl overcame her image issues and how she overcame the loss of the sight in the one eye to become one of the most celebrated writers in all of American history. So it's a little bit of background on Alice Walker. Now, let's talk about Everyday Use. It was published in 1973, and it was published at a time of some very intense racial tension, as you might can imagine. The Civil Acts right had already been passed, so people were, allowed to eat in whatever restaurants they wanted to eat in, and there weren't separate restrooms and separate water fountains anymore, and things like that. But the African Americans, there was a movement called the Back to Africa movement, which really drew a lot of attention, and a lot of people got swept up in that. And basically what this Back to Africa movement was that African American men and women were kind of wanting to go back to their African roots. Their viewpoint was that their ancestors had been forcibly taken from their homelands and brought over to the United States to be slaves, and so they wanted to go back to, say, like the Muslim African religions and take on African names and take on, wear African apparel and take on an African identity. And in our story, Everyday Use, we have a conflict between a mother and a daughter. Now, the mother is living in a shack, to be honest. I mean, the floors are dirt floors, and it's basically not much better than, say, a tool shed, but it's a place to keep dry when it rains, and it's a place to heat up or to cool down depending upon the weather. And she's content with that life. She's content with just being a poor African American woman living in a small southern town, probably in Georgia. But Dee, her daughter, is very ambitious, and her daughter can't wait to get out of that house. She can't wait to get out of that town. So as a result, she ends up convincing the locals to raise enough money to send her to college. We don't know what college she goes to. We know it's in somewhere in Augusta, but we don't know which one. So while she's there, she is exposed to this Back to Africa movement and takes to it very quickly. So that's where the conflict is going to come in, is on those two movements. And the root of this conflict is something called heritage. Now, think back to your parents. Okay, now think back to your grandparents. Think back to your great-grandparents. At some point in your family's history, there's a really good chance somebody's going to say, oh yeah, your great-great-grandfather came to the United States from whatever country. In my case, it was Scotland. But it could be, any country depending upon what your heritage is. So, Dee is going to, and Dee being the daughter, of course, Mrs. Johnson's the mother, Dee is going to want to go back and get in touch with those ancient ancestors, the ones who were enslaved and brought over to the United States to work on the plantations and whatnot. Mrs. Johnson, the mother, has a different idea of what heritage should be. To her, heritage is her family, particularly her immediate family. So we can start with talking about the name. The name is Dee, that her mother gave her because of Dee's grandmother, who, according to the story, was in turn named after another relative. So we get to that point here. Okay. Okay, so anyway, D, who wants to take on the name Wangero Liwanika Kamanjo, actually says when the mom asks what happened to D, she's dead, Wangero said. I couldn't bear it any longer being named after the people who oppressed me. So D is taking the opinion that her name, DC, or D, came from her ancestors' oppressors. Mom, on the other hand, then responds with, you know as well as me, you was named after your Aunt DC. I said, DC is my sister. She was named D. We called her Big D, and after D was born. Well, who was she named after? Asked Wangero. I guess after Grandma D, I said. And who was she named after? Her mother, I said, and saw Wangero was getting tired. That's about as far back as I can trace it, though in fact I probably could have carried it back to the Civil War through the branches. So, that name thing, that was, like I said, a common feature of this Back to Africa movement. The two most well-known examples of this both come from the world of sports. In 1960, a young man by the name of Cassius Clay out of Louisville, Kentucky, won the gold medal in the Olympics. At a certain point in his life, he decided to convert to Islam, and he took on the name Muhammad Ali. And you know Muhammad Ali is probably the greatest boxer, or if not the greatest boxer, at least the greatest showman boxer in all of the history of sport. And then, of course, the other one, there was a young man named Lou Alcindor who won basketball titles at UCLA back when UCLA was a powerhouse. He came to the pros. He took on the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he won NBA titles as a member of the LA Lakers. What D has done here was not all that uncommon. There were plenty of people of African Americans who were converting over to Islam and then taking on these Islamic African names. And I think one of the most hilarious things about this is D, of course, has a man with her who the mom assumes might be a husband, but she decided not to ask because, it's possible they're living in sin. So, the mom can't remember the husband's name, so she calls him Hakima Barber throughout the whole story. And I don't know if your textbook has this footnote, but there might be a note about how Hakima Barber probably was not his likely name. It might have been something else, but the mom couldn't remember it, so she calls him Hakima Barber just so it's something she can remember. All right. So this Back to Africa movement. But getting back to the heritage thing. So Mama is very, very close to her family, her sister, her mom, her grandmother, and on and on. And to her, heritage lies in blood relatives. To D, heritage lies further back than that. To D, heritage lies in the land that her ancestors were brought over from. So this causes a bit of a conflict because D wants to change her name, which I would imagine hurts Mama's feelings since Mama, gave her that name because she loved D so much that she wanted her to carry on the family name. And now D has just, erased it and said, oh, no. That's not my name. My name is Wangero. So Mama's probably wishing that she could have given that name to Maggie. Now, Maggie, of course, is the younger daughter. Now, remember, Maggie does not have the advantages D does. Maggie is not as attractive. Maggie does not have the ambition to leave town and go off to college. And Maggie was burned in a fire as a very young girl, if you'll remember that part of the story, where there's that flashback to the house fire, and how Dee stood under a tree and watched the house burn. And there's some hints there that the mom might think that Dee set the fire on purpose to burn the house down. And furthermore, Mom ended up getting injured by going into the fire to rescue Maggie because Dee would rather stand under the tree and watch the house burn down. So if Mama hadn't gone in and rescued Maggie, there may not be a Maggie to talk about. So Dee really wants to burn down her family past, but she wants to embrace the bigger one. All right. Now, one of the things that Mom has that keeps her connected to her family is heirlooms, family heirlooms. Now, remember that D/Wangero wants to take the butter churn. She doesn't even ask for permission. She grabs the butter churn and she actually throws it in the car because the top is going to make a nice centerpiece for the table, and she'll figure out what to do with the rest of it later. But there's a hint there that Mom needs that butter churn. Remember, when she throws that butter churn into the car, there's clabbered milk in it already. That clabbered milk indicates that Mama still uses that butter churn to make butter. And note, if you'll remember, there's indentions in that little churner thingy where the family has been using it for so many years that it's been worn from use. And that's what Dee likes about it. There's an artistic value to that. So this is another thing that is coming up in this particular story. Artistic value versus its utility or its use value. And that goes back to the blankets as well. So the butter churn is only the first salvo in that little battle. And Dee gets that. Because Dee always gets what she wants, right? Remember, it says in here that Dee has never heard anybody tell her the word no before. She gets anything she wants anytime she wants it. She is the queen bee. And we know she's attractive because a lot of boys wanted to date her until they got to know her a little bit better. And then they couldn't wait to get away from her. Remember the young man who was supposed to marry her and ended up running away from Dee screaming and ended up marrying a common plain girl rather than, the unobtainable Dee. So, there's that issue as well. Dee is kind of full of herself. And nobody's ever told her no. So, we get to the blankets. Or the quilts, actually. Now, these quilts were hand-stitched. And if you'll remember, in fact, there are pieces of the family history woven into these quilts. So, this is after Dee has already came. Oh, I knew there was something else I wanted to ask you if I could have. Of course, what she means is there's something else I wanted to take because she knew, Dee goes into these situations knowing she's going to get what she wants. And so she has the two quilts. And remember that the mom says that she had offered those quilts to Dee before Dee went off to college. And Dee said, no, they're too old-fashioned. I want new stuff. Okay, so the quilts are going to go to Maggie. Maggie, who, by the way, could probably appreciate those quilts a lot more than Dee could. So let's get to this moment. All right, so out came Wangero with two quilts. They had been pieced by Grandma Dee, and then Big D, and then me had hung them on the quilt frames on the front porch and quilted them. One was in the Lone Star pattern, the other was Walk Around the Mountain. And both of them were scraps of dresses Grandma Dee had worn 50 and more years ago. So little pieces of Grandma Dee's dress are in these quilts. Bits and pieces of Grandpa Gerald's paisley shirts. And one teeny faded blue piece about the size of a penny matchbox that was from great-grandpa Ezra's uniform that he wore in the Civil War. Little pieces of the family have been woven into these quilts by Mrs. Johnson, by Grandma Dee, and by Aunt DC and all those folks. So there are pieces of family heritage in these quilts. And now Dee wants them. They've been promised to Maggie, but Dee wants them. Let's take a look at what happens next. Mama, Wangero said, sweet as a bird, can I have these old quilts? I heard something fall in the kitchen, and a minute later the kitchen door slammed. So what do you suppose happened there? Dee asked for the quilts, and the kitchen door slams. Well, there's only one other person in the house, right? That's Maggie. Maggie, and we're going to take a look at that passage in a minute. Maggie, who never gets her way. And she had her heart set on those quilts, apparently, because when the kitchen door slammed, I'm sure it was her storming out in anger. Just absolutely furious that Dee now wants what are really her quilts. Now, Everyday Use is not really a story about Dee or Wangero as much as it is about Mrs. Johnson. One thing to remember about all short stories, there is usually conflict in all of them. In fact, there should be conflict of some sort in all of them. And you can Name all the kinds of conflict. Man versus nature, man versus himself, man versus, whatever. Mama now has her daughter, her spoiled brat daughter, standing in front of her, wanting those quilts. A daughter who has never been told no by Mrs. Johnson in her entire life. What does Mrs. Johnson do? This is going to be the moment of conflict. This is going to be the moment of greatest tension. In storytelling, we call this the climax. This is when the story is at its greatest tension, and whatever happens as a result of this tension, nothing will ever be the same again. There's going to be some kind of a change that comes about. And this comes when Wangero asks for the quilts. All right. Now, so she says that she promised to give them to Maggie when she marries John Thomas. So even though Maggie's covered in scars, she's been betrothed to John Thomas. All right. She, being Wangero, gasped like she had been stung, like a bee had stung her. Maggie can't appreciate these quilts, she said. She'd probably be backwards enough to put them to everyday use. Backwards enough to put these quilts to everyday use. Mama says, I reckon she would. God knows I've been saving them for long enough with nobody using them. I hope she will. Okay. And then, of course, this is the part where she talks about offering to her for college and Dee saying no. But they're priceless, she said at me furiously, for she has a temper. Maggie would put them on the bed, and in 5 years they'd be rags less than that. Okay. Further down. Well, I said, stumped. What would you do with them? Hang them, she said, as if that was the only thing you could do with quilts. This is where we get to that art versus utility. These quilts were made to keep people warm as they sleep in bed at night. Yet Wangero wants these quilts not to put them on the bed so that she and Hakima Barber can stay warm, but instead she wants to hang them up on the wall as decorations. So that when people come visit her house, she can say, look at that little piece of cloth there. That's from a dress that's over 50 years old. And that piece of cloth is from a Civil War uniform. Right? She wants them to be pretty. She doesn't want them to ever get ruined. She wants them to hang up on the wall, and she wants people to look at. Whereas Mama and Maggie would use them for their intended purpose, which is to keep them warm as they sleep at night on cold winter nights. All right. So now, Mama has got an issue. She has promised these quilts to Maggie. Maggie, who never gets anything, who's always the odd one out. And now Dee wants these quilts. All right. Now, climactic moment. Maggie looks up and says, she can have them, Mama. Like somebody used to never win anything or have anything else reserved for her. I can remember Grandma Dee without the quilts. Further down in the next paragraph, she looked at her sister with something like fear, but she wasn't mad at her. This was Maggie's portion. This, of course, being never getting what she wants. This being Dee gets everything. This was Maggie's portion. This was the way she knew God to work. Mama has come to a realization here. In Maggie's mind, God gives everything to Dee, but not to her. Maggie is stuck with being scarred, with living at home instead of getting out of town, with no money. She's been betrothed to some John Thomas, but there's no telling whether she loves him or not. This is Maggie's portion. This is how God works. Now look at what Mama says immediately after that. When I looked at her like that, something hit me in the top of my head and ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and shout. This is a moment of realization, a moment of clarity, a moment of clarification. Mama realizes something that she has never realized before. She's going to do something that she has never done before. In fact, that's the next sentence. I did something I've never done before. We call this an epiphany. Mama's having an epiphany here. Poor Maggie needs a break. Poor Maggie needs to get something she wants, and Dee needs to be told no. And this epiphany hits her with the force of being in church and being moved by the Spirit of the Lord whenever those moments come. I did something I had never done before, hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangero's hands, and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there on the bed with her mouth open. Take one or two of the others, I said to Dee. Right? Maggie's sitting there with a look on her face like, what just happened? This is the first time Maggie has ever beaten Dee. This is the first time Maggie has ever won. And it's because Mrs. Johnson has come to the realization Maggie should start getting all the breaks. Dee has been getting all the breaks all their entire lives. And Maggie is sitting there, first time as a winner. She doesn't know what to say. She doesn't know what to do. She's kind of looking there like, what happened? Right? She's baffled. So, this is Mom's moment of growth. Nothing will ever be the same again. Because remember, what happens immediately after that is instead of grabbing more quilts, Dee grabs her boyfriend or husband or whatever he is. They get in the car and she leaves. And then Mom and Maggie sit on the porch all happy. This is her moment of growth. This is her story. This is how she overcomes some of the demons of her own past. And there will be a new reality now. And the new reality is that she may actually start telling Dee no at times and giving Maggie the breaks sometimes. So that's everyday use. So you've got the heritage angle, you've got the art versus use angle, and you've got that whole epiphany angle of Mama realizing that it's time to start taking care of the daughter who is actually loyal to her and loves her and needs the help more than the firstborn daughter does. So that's it, everyday use. I hope that you found this video enlightening. I hope that you're enjoying it. And if you have any questions, of course, contact me on my office phone or by email, and we can take it from there.